Well, we just heard from Fed Chair Jerome Powell in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Powell delivering a somewhat hawkish tone on inflation and interest rates in his speech. Let's bring in Rich Lesser, Boston Consulting Group Global Chair, to weigh in. Rich, just want to get your headline takeaway, your perspective from what you heard from Powell.
So I would have described it as more cautious than hawkish. And I think we have to respect that. You can't look at the numbers and believe the job is done right now. We're even if you say there's a little flex around 2, it's not at the level that we're at today. It needs to come down further. No one can know if we're finished or not in terms of what needs to happen. But I was actually quite pleased that at the balance of saying we might be able to pause now, or we might need to go further, and we're going to let the data guide us on doing that. I'm not surprised the markets are reacting positively to that versus taking a strong stand either that we're done and if anything, we can start lowering, or on the flip side that we need to go even higher. I thought it was a pretty balanced message.
And what did you say? Hey, Rich, it's Julie here. It's good to see you. What did you make of this sort of, I thought it was interesting. He sort of took input by input, right, of inflation and kind of what they're seeing and what they want to see and how much time it takes to make its way through the economy, which seems to sort of also nod towards some of the critics who have said, let all of this percolate through the economy a bit more because of the long and variable lags. What did you make of that?
Personally, the way he disaggregated the different components and tried to talk about what each one meant and how to read it, I thought was really welcome. And I think there's such a tendency to try to drop to a single number and use that to tell us where we're at versus looking at the different components. I also really appreciated him calling out that real wages are what we really care about in terms of helping workers in this economy, and the real wages are now running ahead of inflation, that it's improving, and it's not necessarily where we want it to be, but I think that was a positive message. And in an ideal world, we want wages to outpace inflation for the long term. And that means that we can't be looking at that we're looking to get back to 2% wage growth as some marker of success. If 2% inflation is the headline number we're looking for. So I thought him breaking those different components apart made sense, and I'm not surprised that that's the general reaction based on the market so far.
Rich, it's been interesting over the course of the earnings season to hear how banks who have views into consumer balances, how they're thinking about consumers, how retail companies who are engaging with them on a transactional basis are thinking about the consumers and evaluating the consumer, and now how Fed Chair Jay Powell is evaluating the consumer as well, saying recent readings on consumer spending have been especially robust, and in addition, after decelerating sharply over the past 18 months, housing sector starting to show signs of picking back up. All of this evidence the Fed weighs to really kind of paint a picture of how they view the consumer. But does that give you a sense that the consumer they're seeing still needs kind of more checks or more curbs put in place so that spending doesn't continue to kind of buy into this inflationary environment?
So at least what I hear from our clients is not a sense of a robust, out of control consumer spending landscape. I think we're seeing mixed signs depending on which retailers you look at about how they're seeing their businesses evolve. I think consumers who still have relatively healthy balance sheets, particularly after a bout of inflation, you could have pictured a much worse situation. Consumer balance sheets are still relatively healthy, but we're not in the position we were in 2 years ago. And on the flip side, the supply side's come back as Jay Powell talked about. So if anything, most of our clients are looking at this landscape and realizing that on the one hand, they don't want inflation more than anyone else, but that actually a low inflation power with consumer balance sheets not quite as strong puts more pressure on pricing power, which has declined as it should in a lower inflation environment, and puts more pressure on finding growth through other means. And I think that we're hearing that from our clients. I think we'll see a huge focus in this year's planning cycle as our clients and as companies in general look to 2024 to figure out not just how they continue to become more resilient and more productive, but how they unlock growth levers in a somewhat more challenging environment. So I think the companies that we're talking to, and we see many of them, are seeing a somewhat more challenging environment on the consumer side than was presented today.
Rich, I definitely want to dig more into what you're hearing from your clients because I think that's really interesting. But first, just one more question on the substance of the speech. Do you think the Fed should be sticking to 2% here? Do you think that that is realistic? And at some point, is it going to have to relent and say, well, maybe 3% is more realistic?
You know, there was a wonderful speech given by Lael Brainard, who is now in the White House, but this was when she was in the Fed pre-COVID. So, by the way, can you see me okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Gotcha.
And we hear you even better.
Okay, great. She gave a speech that talked about average inflationary targeting and noted that 2% is the long-term goal. No one's debating the 2%, but that we will go through periods where we average a bit under 2, as we did most of the last decade, and we will go through periods where we average a bit over 2%. It doesn't change that 2% is the target, but it does say that an obsession to get to 2.00 fast is not necessarily serving the broader economy. And I think at a time when we see this de-risking of supply chains going on, things that will add some net cost as companies focus on other factors to build supply chain resilience, when we see a time when there'll be massive capital spending going into the economy with all the bills that have passed and the focus, I personally think that principle that, yes, we're targeting 2% in the long term, but we may be in a period where we're willing to live with something a bit over 2. Starts with a 2, but not necessarily 2.0. I think that could be a very reasonable place to land. Obviously, that will be a call of the Fed, not of the rest of us. And we'll see. But I personally think, just as we did in the last decade, not obsess to go to negative interest rates in order to drive inflation back from something that started with a 1 to 2.0, we may be in a similar position. But if I were Jay Powell right now, and for sure I am not, to be crystal clear, I think I would still be signaling in the long term 2.0 is the number.